tonight, but giving an opportunity for people to filter in through security and get parked first, obviously. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Reviczky, and I'm the Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Agriculture, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone here today for this timely and very important conference. Connecticut agriculture is growing, and Connecticut farmers are doing a fantastic job of educating the public about farming and agriculture. You know, today, folks, our population is very far removed from the farm. So it's critically important that we all educate folks about the importance of farming and agriculture. And again, our farmers have risen to the occasion and invite their neighbors, the community, the public at large to come to their farms to learn about how they farm, what they do, how they do it, why they do it. And all of those things are critically important to the future of agriculture, not only here in Connecticut, but across the country. This conference has come together with the participation and cooperation and through the efforts of a lot of partners. And I want to first thank the University of Connecticut, the College of Ag, Health, and Natural Resources, and in a moment I'll introduce Dean Weidemann, and the Connecticut Farm Bureau Association, and I will introduce its Executive Director, Henry Talmage. I also want to thank the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Connecticut Department of Public Health, the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and Nationwide Insurance for participating in this conference. I especially want to thank Dr. Bruce Sherman and his team at the Connecticut Department of Agriculture for all their effort in putting this conference together. Thank you very much, Dr. Sherman. I know he was here, he's still here. I want to point out that Senator Clark Chapin is here. He's the ranking member of the Environment Committee here at the Connecticut General Assembly, and they have cognizance over matters involving agriculture. Senator Chapin, thank you for joining us. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Greg Weidemann, the Dean of the College of Agriculture at UConn. Dean Weidemann.
Thanks, Commissioner. I'll keep my remarks short so that we get sort of back on track on our time. But as I drove in this morning, I was thinking about what I might say by way of welcome and opening up this activity today. And I think most of you in this room, I probably don't need to tell you that U.S. agriculture today, less than 3% of our population is directly involved in agriculture, either in animal or plant agriculture. A lot more people helping to support that industry, but those that actually farm and raise animals is a very small part of our population. And what that means is that the general public has become very disconnected from where their food comes from. They don't have that link that previous generations really had back to the farm, that agriculture is what you see in a grocery store, or what you see from the road as you drive down the road. And so there's been a lot of discussion that's gone on, particularly over recent years, about how we sort of reconnect the public to where their food comes, and an appreciation for agriculture, both the science behind agriculture, but just the careers involved in agriculture. And I think the farmers have done a remarkable job, I think, reaching out to the general public, recognizing that this is an imperative to educate people about where their food comes from and how that food is produced that they consume. But you know, there are some, particularly in animal agriculture, there are some inherent public health risks that have to be dealt with, and this session today is really going to deal with that. I was very interested to see that one of the topics today, and I don't want to steal that individual's thunder, is going to talk about One Health. and it's a conversation that we've had at the university within our college for quite some time, and a number of the universities have really embraced. And the fact that we tend to look at sort of human health and animal health and the environments in which they live as sort of separate and apart in their own individual silos, when they're all actually very much interconnected. And so we need to look at both animal health and public human health in a much more holistic context than we have before. And I think a recognition by people that you can't look at these things in silos because of that interconnectedness, and how do we better sort of embrace that One Health concept to move us forward in the public health arena. So, so there's a bigger picture here that revolves around the fact that that human and animal health are very much connected, and and how do we best protect not only the human population that's interacting with the animal population, but the animal population from the human population, because it's really a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. So I think this is a very important session for the people that are here, and a very timely topic to have speakers talk about. So I very much am excited to hear about some of the presenters today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Henry, Executive Director of Connecticut Farm Bureau.
Well, thank you, Greg, and on behalf of Connecticut Farm Bureau, thank you all for attending and welcome. I'd like to kind of reiterate what Commissioner Reviczky said, and point out the good work that Joe Bonelli from UConn and Bonnie Burr, and especially Doc Sherman, did to put this conference together. I think it's a great example of cooperation and trying to address issues that are facing agriculture in close to real time. So it's a really important subject. I'd just like to say real briefly that this is a particular issue that is associated with agritourism in a way, but I also want to just kind of talk about the trends that are happening in agriculture in Connecticut and across the country, frankly, and that this emergence of reinterest in local food, in interest in agriculture. We all see tremendous opportunity in that. Those kinds of opportunities do come with challenges, as we're going to hear some today. But I think we should be more optimistic than pessimistic. And frankly, I think there is, I talk to my counterparts across the country, and I think this is not a New England thing, it's not a Connecticut thing. It's about farming near population, right? So even in states that are considered to be big corporate ag states, in the cities, Des Moines as an example, where I talk to folks who say, we're really seeing an interest in local vegetable production, and farmers markets and CSAs and direct-to-consumer markets. And that's a corn state, right? So this is about population. It's about farming near population, and that means great opportunity. When you look at a population map of the U.S. and look at where Connecticut is, dead smack in between New York and Boston, within a day's drive of that. That's tremendous opportunity. And in fact, we're seeing the trends, obviously, more towards direct-to-consumer marketing. I mean, the growth of farmers markets is an example, the CSAs. More recently, that trend has been shifting more towards on-farm marketing, which agritourism is a very important piece of that. And today's conference is an example of some of the challenges that can come from that. But let's not lose sight of the advantages of engaging with the community and getting them onto our farms and developing and nurturing the relationship with consumers, because that is, frankly, one of the real bright spots in the future of Connecticut agriculture. And so, You know, we see this dealing with local land use issues and kind of the intersection between agritourism and local land use and zoning. Those are challenges that will have to be worked out too. But the reality is there's a lot of opportunity. What I hope happens in conferences like this is that we realize there are challenges that have to be addressed, but we never lose our grasp on optimism about the potential of agritourism and what that means for the future of local agriculture and Connecticut agriculture. So with that, I'll stop, invite Commissioner Reviczky back up, and again, welcome, and we appreciate you being here today.
So as someone who likes to eat and see beautiful plants and trees, I also want to thank Connecticut's farmers for all that you do and all that you continue to do as our industry grows and evolves. So thank all of you for doing, for working so hard and doing all that you do every single day. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Thomas McKenna. Tom is the District Director for Surveillance, Preparedness, and Response Services for the United States Department of Agriculture. I'm gonna say it all because he has it.
It's a short day.
The United States Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Veterinary Services. And Dr. McKenna earned his DVM and his PhD from the University of California, Davis. He worked for 13 years at the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. During that time, he worked on recombinant DNA vaccines for foot and mouth disease and held several positions within the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory. In addition to that, he led the diagnostic laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. So with that, Dr. McKenna will lead us in today's discussions, and I thank him very much for being here and being a great partner to all of us.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks everyone, and you can just see it's a guy who can't keep a job. He's got to move around. You know, when Bruce started talking to me about putting together this this workshop, and I started thinking about, you know, boy, we as a society, you know, have been engaged with livestock since we became, you know, agrarians. You know, when we quit being hunters and gatherers, and we've lived very close to livestock over all those years. But lately we have moved away, and a lot of people aren't around livestock anymore. And with that, their exposure to some of the pathogens and the different bacteria and viruses and fungus, things like that. You know, they just don't have the immune system set up to fight that stuff. Meanwhile, they're spraying a lot of stuff on them all the time, antibacterial this, antibacterial that. So what seems like a very small risk, especially people who live on farms and around animals all the time. You know, how can you get sick? I've been with these animals constantly. It's not a threat. There are situations where it can become a public health situation. And vice versa, people can bring some things to the livestock. So I think that even though it's a small risk, the impact of when we have something like this happen can be huge. And so we need to minimize that risk as we engage with the public on our farms. My daughter has a small farm outside of Albany, pasture-raised chickens and ducks and pigs, and she has some lambs, and they sell from the farm. You know, and I try and talk to her about, well, you know, honey, make sure and wash your hands, you know. Dad, you know, come on. You know, kids are. But, I mean, the point is, we all think that way. The risk seems quite small, especially for those of us that are living among animals and rarely get stuff. But I think you're going to see today that the impact of an event can be pretty big, And there are some things we can do to minimize the risk, and so I think this is very timely time to get together and talk about this. And the agenda looks great. It's full of experts. I'm going to introduce them. I'll give brief introductions, but in your folder, the yellow sheet has more in-depth description of everybody's background, and it's a great cast of characters this morning. So before I introduce the first speaker, I have a couple of housekeeping things. One is the bathrooms. So if you go out the door and go to the right, there's two big double doors that are shut with exit above them. Don't go out there, but make a right before you go through those doors. And there's bathrooms there. And then for lunch, the cafeteria is downstairs. So take the escalator, if it's working, or the elevators, and you go behind the elevators and there's a cafeteria down there. So with that, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Megan Nichols, who is the enteric zoonoses team lead. So enteric more or less means your gut, and zoonoses are the diseases that we share with non-human animals. And so this is right down her alley. Megan works for the CDC in Atlanta, and she got her DVM from Colorado State University and did a MPH at University of Minnesota. So with that, Megan, I'd like you to come up and get started. There she is.
Perfect. Okay. All right, a podium that I can actually see over. This is a rare luxury. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. I have to say thank you so much for this invitation to be here and to speak with you today. One of the things that I do in my job on a regular basis is to work with states and their health partners and ag partners to investigate outbreaks of disease that are linked with contact to animals. And it is exceedingly rare. We investigate many of these each year, but it's rare that after an event, the community gets together to have a conversation and a dialogue about how to prevent these events in the future. And so I think it speaks volumes to see the interest from the community, interest from your state leaders in coming together to discuss this topic. So thank you to all of you who have come today to discuss this, and thank you for hosting this event. I think this is really, really essential, and I think will serve as a model for others around the country. So one of the things that's not in my bio is I grew up outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a really rural area, ranch land. And to this day, my parents' home still does not have an address. They tried to work it in so that there would be some medical service type address in case there was an event. But I come from an area that is steeped in agriculture, and something that it's very near and dear to my heart and important to me as well. So a lot of times I'll go into these outbreak situations and folks will say, well, you're from Atlanta. What do you know about my farm? And oftentimes I say, well, not much, because I know every farm is different. But also I grew up in this type of setting, and so it's something that I'm very, very passionate about personally as well as professionally. So that's where I come from. And I think to CDC's credit, they actually looked for someone with that experience when they hired me into this position. All right, so one of the things I want to talk about today is basically these events. It's not just a Connecticut thing. It's not just something that happens in the Northeast. In fact, it happens all around the country. But there is good news, it's preventable. So what is a zoonosis, or what is a zoonotic disease? It's a disease that has the potential to be transmitted between people and animals. And again, as Dr. McKenna and others have pointed out this morning, it's not necessarily a one-way street. It's not just something that people can get from animals. It's things that we can give to animals as well. And there's a lot of examples of that. So when you look across these different diseases, what do they look like? Well, there's fungi, there's bacteria, Those are most common. There's parasites. So it's a wide range of pathogens. So has anyone in here ever had clubworm fungus? That's pretty good, I've had it. So one of the things that when I worked in New Mexico, I would hear a lot is our ag veterinarians who were checking in animals to the county fair. And they'd call and they'd say, Doc, why is this a big deal? Why are we excluding these kids' lambs from these events for clubworm fungus or ringworm? And is this really a big deal? The kids aren't getting it. And I'd say, well, you know, for a lot of these kids who've been around these lambs, they know not to touch this area, they know how to wash their hands. But if you have someone who's visiting that county fair with an immune suppressed child who happens to want to pet the lamb, it's going to make a huge difference. And while most kids will get that infection and get over it without any complications, there are some that can become extremely ill. So when we talk about these pathogens, what we're really looking at is not necessarily the most healthy part of the population. The ones these diseases really, really impact are those that are elderly, really young, or immune suppressed in some way. All right, so how does this happen? Well, the most common route, and people love when I bring this up, is fecal oral. So I noticed my talk isn't before lunch. That was a good call. But it's basically interacting with areas that are contaminated and then putting your hands that touch these areas into your mouth. And while most adults might not do that, there are probably some adults that bite their nails, and so they do. This is a really, really common behavior among young children. In addition, there are some diseases that can be spread through respiratory droplets. So that includes things like plague, which was common in the Southwest where I'm from, but it also includes influenza. And then there's also the transcutaneous route. Anybody know the disease that's spread that way? Think about animal bites. Rabies, absolutely. And while rabies isn't as much of a concern in this country as it is in some others, I think some of our speakers afterwards will demonstrate that it still happens here in the US, so we still need to be aware of it. So our flip team at CDC put together this graphic, and it's something that I think really does a good job of exemplifying the route in which a lot of these pathogens are actually transmitted to people from animals. So one of the things you can see, and this is an example for avian influenza, is, and I love this because it shows that the pathogen, and this could be salmonella as well, for example, exists on the feathers or the fur of the animal. If you're holding that animal and touching your face, that's how you can get it. But you can also see that there's an environmental component. So you can see that, and they did a great job. With these infographics, we debate oftentimes for hours as to how exactly something is going to look if it's, you know, feces oriented. So you can see they did a great job of demonstrating that chickens poop. They poop a lot. Those of you that have chickens, it's all over their coop. It gets everywhere. And that is a mechanism by which people can get disease if they're in these areas and they're walking in it. They might not change their shoes before they go inside, or they're cleaning the coop and they might not wash their hands immediately after. So something to consider. So one of the things that's tricky is that a lot of our general public don't necessarily realize that these pathogens that cause us to become ill don't necessarily make the animals sick. So salmonella, for example, is normal gut flora for chicken and reptiles. It's not necessarily something that's going to cause illness in the animal. This is similar with E. coli and our ruminant species, so cattle, sheep, and goats. E. coli exists in their gastrointestinal tract, but isn't necessarily going to make them sick. Also, these animals shed the bacteria, and when I say shed, meaning it comes out of their, through their intestines, out into the environment through their feces. So it's shed into the environment intermittently, oftentimes during periods of stress. So we have a lot of groups that say, well, in this, for example, petting zoo, one thing we'll just do is we'll test our animals. And if they're negative for E. coli, we can say with confidence that our animals aren't going to make people sick. Well, that's not necessarily true, because on one day, you might test them and they'll be negative, but the very next day, you'll test them and they'll be positive. And I have to say that when you have a lot of little kids coming and running and really excited to see the goats and the sheep and hugging and kissing and squeezing on them, that can be pretty stressful for these animals. And stress can increase shedding of these bacteria. The other thing is treatment does not necessarily reliably eliminate the bacteria. So oftentimes with certain bacteria, people will say, well, why don't we give the animals antibiotics? And we'll clear this infection and then they'll be okay. Well, that's not necessarily something we want to do. Number one, it's not making the animal sick. So there's no reason to administer antibiotics in these cases. The second is that oftentimes you might clear out one strain of bacteria only to have it replaced by another that can be more pathogenic. And then it can create antimicrobial resistant bacteria, and that's something that overall no one wants to see. So that's not something that we recommend. And again, animals that are stressed, and you can imagine in a lot of these environments, they will be stressed, are more likely to shed these types of organisms that are harmful to human health. All right, anyone here have calves on their farm? Young dairy calves? All right. So one of the things we notice is that every year there are outbreaks of a parasite called Cryptosporidium. And sometimes, most often, they're associated with swimming pools and feces in the pool. But oftentimes we do see them associated with on-farm events that are held where children have exposure to these young calves. And for some reason, and I haven't figured out the human behavior that's associated with it yet, but children love to stick their fingers in the calves' mouths and let them suck on them. It's something, I'm not sure why it happens, but I've watched my own nieces and nephews do this, and then they look back at me and grin, like, take that, Auntie Megan. They're characters. But it's something that, and then that finger goes in their mouth, or they chew on their nails. So it's also something for us to remember that these animals, especially young animals, can shed these bacteria and these parasites. It's very common with Cryptosporidium in their feces. We also see outbreaks occur at veterinary schools or at schools where college students have exposure to these animals either through farm rotations or other events. Seasonal shedding occurs. So sometimes these animals will shed in higher amounts during certain times of year, and that's something that's reported in the literature. Improper maintenance or layout of facilities. So I think this is something that can also help facilitate transmission, or it can really help with prevention. And we'll go over a little later this afternoon what we consider proper layout of a facility. And it's something that everyone has to take and adapt to their own farm and look at how it's going to work. But we have some ideas about how you can lay out a facility to promote good human health behavior. All right. Now, some other things I mentioned when I say inadequate layout or looking at your facilities, number one, always have hand washing available for the public. I'm going to say it again. Please always have hand washing available and have signs posted to encourage them to wash their hands, and maybe even have people there to encourage them to wash their hands. This is essential. It's almost the bare minimum, but it's crucial to preventing these outbreaks. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about some of these as we go through, but I think we have a question.
Oh, I didn't know, a question's okay, do you wanna?
Absolutely, I actually like to have discussion.
Okay, so for hand washing stations, are hand sanitizer, little pump things okay, or do you feel like it has to be water and soap? What's the right situation for hand washing?
Thanks for that question. So the question was, in case those in the far reaches of the room didn't hear it, is it okay to have hand sanitizer available, or do we really prefer hand washing stations? And the reason for that, so hand sanitizer is recommended When you have a venue where folks can't necessarily get to hand washing stations right away, it's a great intermediate step on the way to wash your hands. However, because oftentimes at these farm events and venues, your hands will become grossly contaminated with dirt, with manure, with straw, with hay, with fur, oftentimes the hand sanitizer can't necessarily penetrate that. So hand washing, soap and water, doesn't even have to be hot water, and a clean towel, paper towel, for example, to dry your hands is essential. So hand sanitizer is a great step, but we really, really encourage people to wash their hands for that reason. Yes?
Mr. Paul, I see them at eastern states, they'll have the hand washing stations, pump the water with your foot and everything like that. What do those go for individually?
That's an excellent question. So I looked up and I actually found some online, and the cost varies widely. I think sometimes the cost of shipment can be kind of hefty, but I think that's something that you can look online. You can look and talk with your county extension folks a little bit more about that. I noticed that if you order in bulk, sometimes it's cheaper, so getting together with your neighbors who might have these types of venues and putting in an order together. So I can't necessarily speak to the exact cost because it varies a little bit, but I can say that I think they're mostly reasonably affordable, and maybe you buy one for your community and you just throw it in the back of the truck, send it down the street to your neighbor when they're going to do something.
Rental is about $80 per
Rent-
unit per month.
Rental, $80 per unit per month. Thank you. All right. So when we look across the states and see how often these outbreaks occur, anyone have any idea? I put the number up here. Over 200 outbreaks from 1996 to present. Any idea how many over 200? If you had to guess, how many outbreaks we've seen? These are linked to animal contact in public settings. And the way we classify public is if you open up a farm or a venue and allow the public onto that farm, that's considered a public event. Any ideas? It's close to doubling right now. We have over 400 of these, absolutely. And this is something that is in guidance that I'll talk a little bit about, and it's something that we're going to be redoing and revisiting this year. So after this, if you have any ideas based on your experiences for improving this document, I think we're all ears. It's going to be done in October. So most of these illnesses are caused by Salmonella, E. coli, and the parasite Cryptosporidium. So Salmonella and E. coli are bacterial illnesses. E. coli is the one that's most often associated with petting zoos, agritourism, on-farm events. Salmonella we see frequently with backyard poultry. We currently have the largest outbreak of Salmonella nationwide associated with backyard poultry that's ongoing. And crypto, again, I think calves, events with the calves, and veterinary schools or other college events with these calves. And the burden of illness is pretty high. Anyone know one of the reasons why? If you look at hospitalization rates across other outbreaks, like a foodborne outbreak, for example, the hospitalization rate is higher with these enteric zoonotic outbreaks, so these outbreaks linked to animals. Any ideas why?
Because they're outside? Because of the air?
Air, outside. That's a theory. I haven't investigated that one.
Well, if it's in a building, you're saying it's a hospital, it's enclosed.
Right, so you might have greater exposure of people who go into that environment, absolutely. Who do these impact the most? Anyone have any ideas about what type of the population? You probably see these folks. Young children, absolutely. These outbreaks greatly affect young children.
Immune system isn't as good as ours.
Right, right. Their immune system is
young.
under the age of 5. Yes. And so these outbreaks, when they happen, have substantial public health, medical, community impact, legal impact, economic impact. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we're preventing those impacts to the extent possible, and it is possible. So before I came, I like to visit the parenting blogs because in my opinion, oftentimes you can pick up where your next outbreak might be depending on the parenting blogs. So this is one for Connecticut, and I have the link there in the corner, but it's an advertisement for all of the festivals that are coming up in the state in the fall. And it lists over 20 different farm events, and it includes everything from hay rides to pumpkin patches. And I looked at them and I counted the number that listed animals and food side by side right next to each other. There are a lot of them, right? And this is one that particularly caught my eye, again, and one of the reasons there is that it actually advertises, come to our farm and hold a baby chick, right? And the parenting blogs, the comments for that post, they were going wild. They loved this idea. But this is what happens in my mind. Hold a baby chick. However, how can you put that in there when we know that one of the largest national outbreaks that primarily is impacting children is currently ongoing, right? One of the things I have to say about this is don't set yourself up for that, right? There are so many things that we can prevent. Come and view the baby chicks. Come and see how they're housed. Come and see how our farm properly takes care of these animals. Learn about animal agriculture. But don't necessarily have hold the baby chick, please. All right. Now this is a paper that I pulled. It's getting a little bit older now, but it actually looks at across some state and county fairs. It looks at the rate of Salmonella and E. coli in animals. So this was animals in their environments where they were housed. So how do you think this compares, especially for cattle and for pork, to what you might see in for cattle of feedlot and for swine post-slaughter carcass testing? Do you think what you see in petting zoos and agricultural county fairs is going to be greater or less than what you'd see in a feedlot? Less, right? It's actually the same. Yeah. So when we look at this study that was done, and again, it's getting a little bit older, for cattle, 13% is what they found in terms of shedding of these pathogens at the county fair. And if you look across feedlot studies, that's also what you see. Sometimes in the feedlots, you see less. Same thing for swine. If you look at post-slaughter carcass swabs where they test those for pathogens, it's pretty much the same as what they saw at the county fairs. The difference, I would say, is that people know and understand they need to cook their meat, but they don't necessarily associate these animals that are living and breathing and walking around their pens with those same pathogens. Now, a lot of our materials at CDC say petting zoo. And in talking with other groups, one of the things I hear most often is, I am not a petting zoo. I am a working farm. And I would like the community to be able to come onto my property and see what a farm looks like and how their food is produced. And I think that's a great opportunity. I have to say, even though we use the word petting zoo, it's something that also incorporates farms and agritourism events. There are a couple different things that I see popping up. Another one is animal rental programs. Has anyone seen Rent a Chick? Yeah. Right? You can get a chick in a shoebox, 1 or 2, bring them home with you and your children over the weekend, and then return them on Monday. Now, one of my thoughts around this is that it's probably more traumatic for these little chicks to be tucked in a shoebox, going home with someone over the weekend, but there's also a significant human health risk there. The other part of this is that they have programs where we have reptile guys in Atlanta. I don't know if you have that here, but this van will pull up in front of your house for your kids' birthday parties and unload snakes and bearded dragons and turtles, and reptiles carry salmonella, and allow them to come into your 3-year-old's birthday party and the kids to hold them, but they don't necessarily have a mobile hand washing station with them. So these types of events are also popping up and are increased opportunity for people who might not know a lot about animals and some of the pathogens they carry and not know to wash their hands. There's an increased opportunity for folks to have exposure to them. So what do we see in terms of outcomes? Well, when I mention these things to my father, and he's the audience that I always try to message to. He was always very clear growing up in terms of where our food came from. In fact, sometimes when we said grace at dinner, it would be, dear God, thank you for Bubba the cow who gave his life for us to be able to have this steak this evening. We were very clear as to where our food came from. And when I talk to my father about this, he'll say, I grew up in this dairy environment in upstate New York. I never got sick, not once. I don't know what you people are doing these days or what kind of interactions they have with animals, but I never got sick. And I finally figured out what to tell him. So I said, Dad, you are a medical miracle. You are the one person who has never had a diarrheal illness in their life. In fact, Dad, after you die, I am going to donate your body to science. And that stopped really quick. But I have to say that that is an argument that we make, and absolutely, some of us might have had really, really mild infection and recovered without even knowing much about it. Some of us might get sick and think it was, something that we ate. But there are subsets of the population who get really, really sick. And that includes gastrointestinal illness, so diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, abdominal cramps, hemolytic uremic syndrome. And this is pretty much total meltdown of the kidneys. This can result in kids needing to be on dialysis or receive kidney transplants. This is very, very serious. Guillain-Barré syndrome. With listeria, we can see abortions and stillbirth in pregnant women. Respiratory infection, neurologic diseases. And when you look at the estimates of disease that are caused or linked to animal contact, it's not insignificant. It's very, very high. And in order to prevent this is the kind of group that we need, because I'm certainly not going to convince folks. You guys are the ones interfacing with the public and have that opportunity to educate them, not only about agriculture and what goes on at the farm, but also about how to interact with these animals appropriately. So again, we mentioned this earlier, children are at greater risk. Consistently, when we look at these outbreaks, we see that parents and children have a lack of awareness that these germs are present in the environment. In any child, there are frequent hand-to-mouth activities, pacifiers, thumb sucking, nail biting, and oftentimes in many of these venues there is inadequate hand washing. A lot of children, their immune systems are still developing, so inherently they're not able to fight off these infections as well as immune competent adults might be. Now this is one of the landmark outbreaks that was written up, and it's a fair in North Carolina, and it looked at the age of people in 2004 who had attended this event. So we're going to go through a couple of outbreaks, and you'll see this is not something that's new, and so I want to change course in these outbreaks. If I could only come to these types of meetings and never talk about an outbreak, but talk about how they were things of the past, that would be amazing. So if you look at this, and I think that question was very appropriate, what ages of children are we looking at? Well, these outbreaks primarily affect children under the age of 5, and they're the ones who are most likely to suffer the really severe syndromes associated with infections, with E. coli, hemolytic uremic syndrome. And if we look at some of these lessons that were learned and what children did, children had contact with manure in the petting zoo. Little kids are still learning to get their feet under them. A lot of them fell into the manure, sucked their thumbs. The question about hand sanitizer, in this case, sick and healthy kids reported using hand sanitizers equally. So in this case, the use of hand sanitizer did not prevent infection. And when kids' parents knew that animals could potentially spread disease, the kids were less likely to get sick.